When I turned onto my street that evening, I saw my couch before I saw my apartment building. It was sitting on the curb like garbage. My mattress was leaning against the streetlight. Boxes of my clothes were scattered across the sidewalk. One had burst open, and my winter coat was half dragging through a puddle near the drain. For a second I thought there had been a break-in. Then I tried my key. The lock had been changed. That's when Rick stepped out onto the porch across the yard like he had been waiting for me. "Should have fixed your attitude," he said. Casual. Almost bored. I stood there frozen. Neighbors peeked through their windows. A couple of kids on bikes had stopped to stare. My entire life was sitting in the street like it meant nothing. My hands were shaking. Before I continue, we would like you to support our community and help us continue to creating high-quality content. We'd love for you to like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement helps our videos reach a wider audience and inform our algorithm about the type of content you enjoy. If you'd like to stay up to date on our latest videos and be part of our growing community, please hit the notification bell. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more content with you in the future. Then my elderly neighbor Margaret walked up beside me and placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Don't panic," she whispered. "I recorded everything." I looked at her. Then I looked back at Rick, who was already walking back inside like the whole thing was done. In that moment, something shifted deep inside me. This wasn't over. Not even close. 3 weeks before my life ended up on that sidewalk, the apartment still felt like a fresh start. I had moved to this quiet Midwestern town to escape the noise of Chicago. Remote job. Cheaper rent. A chance to breathe again. The apartment wasn't fancy, but it was mine. 2 small bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a window overlooking a row of oak trees. I thought I had found some peace. Then one Tuesday evening while I was making pasta on the stove, the kitchen outlet crackled. A sharp blue flash. Then the smell of burning plastic filled the room. I yanked the plug from the wall and stepped back. When I pulled off the outlet cover to get a closer look, I wished I hadn't. Black mold. Spreading behind the wall like a shadow. My stomach sank. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time that night, staring at my phone. I didn't want to cause trouble. I just wanted to live safely in a place I was paying for every single month. But the damage was real and it needed fixing. So the next morning I called Rick. I kept my voice polite and calm. I had no way of knowing that one simple phone call was about to change everything. Rick showed up 2 days later. I had expected someone professional, a landlord who took his responsibilities seriously. Instead, he arrived in a faded sweatshirt with his hands in his pockets, looking like I had pulled him away from something more important. He didn't step fully inside the kitchen before making his judgment. "Looks fine to me," he said. I pointed to the outlet. I showed him the exact spot where the flash had come from. Then I showed him the mold behind the drywall. Dark green and black patches spreading upward like something living. Rick shrugged. "Old building," he said flatly. "You get character with places like this." I stared at him. He gave me a slow, measured look, like he was deciding something. "Tenants who make too many problems," he said, "don't usually last long here." Then he smiled slightly, like it was a joke between old friends. I laughed it off. I told myself he was just being awkward and didn't mean anything by it. But standing in that kitchen after he left, something sat heavy in my chest. The kind of feeling you get when someone says one thing but means something else entirely. Now I know it wasn't awkward at all. It was a warning. A week after Rick's visit, a heavy thunderstorm rolled through town. I had just gotten into bed when I heard it. A soft, steady sound from the kitchen. I lay still for a moment, hoping I was wrong. Drip, drip, drip. I got up and turned on the light. Water was pushing through the kitchen ceiling and hitting the floor in a slow, steady stream. I grabbed the biggest pot I owned, slid it under the leak, and took photos of everything. Then I sat on the kitchen floor and watched the dripping, trying to understand how bad the damage actually was. The next morning I texted Rick the pictures. I kept the message short and polite. I explained the leak, mentioned it was likely connected to the existing moisture problem, and asked him to schedule a repair as soon as possible. His response came 10 minutes later. "Stop exaggerating." 3 words. No plan. No explanation. I put my phone down and sat with those 3 words for a while. That was the moment I decided to start saving every message Rick sent me. Every text. Every email. I wasn't entirely sure why yet. But something about the way he answered made me uneasy. Like he already knew this wasn't going to end with a repair visit. Margaret noticed the buckets on my kitchen floor the next morning. She had lived in the building for 11 years. A quiet woman in her late 70s, sharp eyes behind wire-framed glasses, always carrying a mug of tea when she stepped outside. She knocked softly on my door before I had finished my first cup of coffee. I opened it and she looked past me at the buckets without saying a word. "Come in," I said. I explained everything. The outlet, the mold, the leak, Rick's 3-word response. Her expression didn't shift much while I talked, but when I finished, she looked at me carefully. "You're the 4th tenant he's done this to," she said. I went very still. She explained the pattern. Someone moves in, notices a problem, asks for repairs, and suddenly everything gets harder. Maintenance stops. Warning notices pile up. Until the tenant runs out of energy and moves out quietly. Then the apartment goes back on the market. For double the rent. Margaret said she had watched it happen 3 times before I arrived. She wasn't angry when she said it. She was just tired. Hearing it from her, understanding what Rick was actually doing, made everything click into place in a way that made my stomach turn. A few days after talking with Margaret, I heard Rick outside. I wasn't trying to listen. I was washing dishes when his voice drifted through my open kitchen window from the parking lot below. He was talking with a man I didn't recognize, someone carrying a clipboard. I turned off the faucet. "Once she's gone, I can renovate this unit and list it for $1,500 easy," Rick said. I gripped the edge of the sink. My rent was $800 a month. He wasn't trying to maintain the apartment. He wasn't even pretending. He was running a simple calculation and I was the only thing standing between him and nearly double the income. I understood everything now. The ignored repairs. The dismissive shrug. The comment about tenants who cause problems. None of it was careless or accidental. It was deliberate. Rick had been pushing me toward the door from the moment I called him about that outlet. My complaint hadn't bothered him. It had simply given him the excuse to start the process. I stood at that sink for a long time after he walked away. For the first time, I wasn't just frustrated. I was focused, and I started making a plan. Instead of calling Rick again, I sat down and typed a formal written repair request. Polite, professional, documented. I listed every problem in detail. The electrical outlet, the mold behind the kitchen wall, the ceiling leak. I included the date I had first reported each issue and attached screenshots of Rick's ignored texts. I sent it by email so every word would have a clear timestamp. Then I printed 2 copies. One for my records and one I slid under the building mailbox slot. The next morning, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs before 7. Rick knocked hard. When I opened the door, his face was red. "You trying to threaten me with legal stuff now?" he snapped. I kept my voice level and calm. "I just want the repairs done," I said. He stared at me for a long moment. That same slow, cold look from his first visit. "We'll see how long you stay here," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked back down the stairs. I closed my door and stood still for a moment. My heart was beating fast. But I didn't panic. I had done nothing wrong. And I was beginning to understand that doing nothing wrong wasn't going to be enough to protect me on its own. Over the next several days, things started going wrong in small, calculated ways. My trash pickup suddenly stopped. Bags I left out on collection days sat untouched the next morning. When I called the building maintenance number, nobody picked up. When I messaged Rick, he either ignored me or replied with single words. Then the emails started coming. Lease violation. Excessive noise. I had been home working quietly at my laptop. Lease violation. Hallway obstruction. I had left my doormat outside my door for 2 hours. None of it was real. Margaret knocked one afternoon and told me quietly that Rick had done the same thing to a young couple upstairs 2 years before. False warnings. Steady pressure. Waiting for them to crack and leave on their own. I showed her the emails. She shook her head slowly. "He's building a paper trail," she said. She was right. He wasn't trying to remove me with the truth. He was layering false documentation, hoping I would get scared or exhausted before he had to do anything more extreme. I printed every fake warning. I labeled them with dates. I added them to my growing folder. If Rick was building a case against me, then I was building one against him. On a Thursday afternoon, while I was deep in a work call from my bedroom, Rick made his move. I didn't find out until hours later. Margaret told me that while I was at work, a dark blue pickup truck pulled into the lot. 2 men got out. Rick met them at the entrance and spoke briefly. She watched from her window as Rick used a key to open my apartment door. Then she heard him give the order clearly. Take everything out. She said she stood very still, not quite believing what she was watching. The men moved in and out in a steady rhythm. My couch first dragged down the steps and dropped on the curb. Then boxes of clothes, kitchen items. My bedding bundled and left on the concrete. My home. All of it on the sidewalk like it was cleared from a junk room. Margaret didn't call out to stop them. She didn't confront anyone. She did something far smarter. She picked up her phone, moved close to her window and pressed record. The camera caught everything. Rick's voice. The men carrying boxes out. The lock being changed. Every second. He never once looked up toward her window. Standing on the sidewalk that night, Margaret held her phone out to me. Watch, she said quietly. I pressed play. The video was clear. The parking lot lights were bright enough to catch every detail. You could hear Rick's voice directing the men. You could see my boxes hitting the pavement. You could see my couch shoved down the front steps. And at the very end you could see Rick close my apartment door and change the lock himself with a small silver key. Then he dusted his hands off, like he had just finished a simple chore. I watched it twice without speaking. My hands were shaking. My throat felt tight. What I was watching wasn't just painful. It was criminal. Rick had removed my belongings without any court order. He had changed my locks while my lease was still active. He had used 2 strangers to carry out the work. And he had done all of this in the middle of the afternoon while I was at my job. He did it because he thought I was powerless. He did it because he believed no one was watching. But Margaret had been watching. And that short video in her hand was about to become the most important piece of evidence in this entire situation. That night I sat in Margaret's apartment on her small sofa, because I had no apartment to go back to. She brought me tea I didn't drink and a blanket I didn't unfold. I sat with my phone thinking hard. Rick had made a serious mistake. I knew that. But knowing something and proving it are 2 completely different problems. I searched online for a tenant rights hotline. I found a free legal aid number run by a housing rights organization. I called at 9:45 that night. A calm woman's voice answered on the second ring. Her name was Anne. She handled housing complaints every day. I told her everything from the beginning. The outlet, the mold, the fake violations, the formal repair request, and finally tonight. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she paused. Then she said 4 words in a clear, steady voice. That eviction is illegal. She explained exactly what Rick had done wrong. No court order. No proper written notice. No legal process at all. Every step was a direct violation of tenant protection law. She told me to file a housing complaint first thing in the morning. And for the first time since I found my couch on the sidewalk, something inside me steadied. I filed the housing complaint online at 7 the next morning, sitting at Margaret's kitchen table. I attached everything. The original repair requests with timestamps. Rick's dismissive responses. The fake lease violation emails. And Margaret's video. 3 days later, 2 city housing inspectors arrived at the building. I watched from the front steps as they introduced themselves to Rick in the parking lot. He greeted them with a relaxed smile, the kind that says everything is perfectly under control. I watched that smile carefully. The inspectors worked through the building methodically. First the electrical panel in the basement. Then my former unit, which Rick had already relocked. Then the kitchen ceiling where water had been leaking into my pot for weeks. They found the mold without any direction from me. One inspector crouched near the baseboard and shook his head. Then they checked the ceiling damage. The water had been soaking through the plaster for months. The problem was far worse than I had realized. Rick stood in the doorway with his arms crossed tight. His smile was completely gone. One inspector straightened up and looked directly at him. "Rick," he said, "when was the last time this building passed inspection?" Rick opened his mouth, then closed it, and said nothing at all. The inspectors spent most of that day inside the building. They moved room to room with clipboards and cameras, taking quiet notes. Rick followed at first, offering explanations, telling them old buildings required patience. The inspectors weren't interested in patience. They were interested in facts. By the end of the afternoon, the violations list was long. Faulty electrical wiring in 2 units. Water damage in 3 separate areas. A ventilation problem in the basement untouched for years. Rick blamed tenants. He blamed the building's age. He blamed the weather. But one inspector, a quiet man with steady eyes, pulled out a different document entirely. He spread it on the kitchen counter and studied it with care. Building records. The official registered documentation for every unit in the property. He looked at the paperwork. Then he looked up and counted the doors in the hallway. Then back at the paperwork. His expression shifted in a way that made Rick go very still. Because the number of units physically inside this building did not match what was written in the official records. In that single moment, the investigation stopped being about mold and a leaking ceiling. It was about to become something much larger than any of us had expected. According to the official town records, the building was registered for 6 residential apartments. When the inspectors walked the full building, they counted 8. 2 units had no registration at all. No permits. No official lease records on file. No legal existence anywhere. Which meant Rick had been collecting rent on apartments that did not legally exist. I learned this from Margaret that evening. She had overheard the inspectors talking before they left. One had made a phone call saying the case needed to go to the housing board right away. Margaret stood in her doorway with her arms folded. "He's been doing this for a long time," she said. I sat with that for a while. 2 illegal apartments in this one building. 2 groups of tenants paying full rent on units with no legal standing, no inspection history, and no tenant protections of any kind. Rick wasn't just a careless landlord cutting small corners. He was running a deliberate system. And my eviction, the thing he had executed so casually and so confidently, had cracked open the door on everything hidden beneath it. I didn't sleep well that night. But for the first time since any of this began, I wasn't afraid. I was paying very close attention. Once the housing board got involved, they didn't stop at one building. They pulled Rick's complete property records. Every address registered under his name in the county. Every building he managed or owned anywhere in the surrounding area. And what they found, address by address, looked exactly the same. Unregistered units. Safety repairs ignored for years. Tenants who had quietly moved out, always just before repairs became legally unavoidable. I learned this through Anne, who had stayed in contact and was helping me file additional paperwork. When the full scope came up in one of our calls, she chose her words carefully. But she was clear. "Your case opened a door," she said. "There are a lot of people behind it." That sentence stayed with me all day. My situation had never only been about a leaking ceiling. Rick had been running this same operation across multiple properties for years. Move tenants in. Ignore their complaints. Push them out before costly repairs became obligations. Renovate the unit. Charge double. Multiply that across nearly 10 buildings. Across dozens of tenants. Across 4 years. The number of people he had harmed was far larger than I had first understood. And the investigation was only getting started. 2 days after the inspection results were sent to the housing board, there was a knock at Margaret's door. I was sitting in her kitchen when she answered it. A man stood in the hallway. Medium height, quiet eyes, plain jacket. He introduced himself as Tom. He used to do repair and maintenance work for Rick across several local properties. He had heard about the investigation, and he had something he wanted to share. Margaret let him in without hesitation. Tom sat across from me at the kitchen table and set a worn envelope between us. "I kept everything," he said. Inside were photos. Repair jobs he had performed over 3 years. Electrical fixes, wiring replacements, structural patching. All done without permits. All paid by Rick in cash to avoid any official documentation. Tom also had handwritten invoices. Notes from Rick ordering work that legally required licensed contractors. "He told me inspectors never came around," Tom said. "Said I didn't need to worry about permits." I asked why he was coming forward now. He looked down at the table for a moment. Because I did the electrical work in your apartment, he said quietly. And I've been worried about it ever since. I thought the investigation was moving steadily forward, but Rick had other plans. 3 days after Tom came to Margaret's door, I received an official notice from the county housing office. Rick had filed a formal complaint against me. He claimed I had caused significant damage to the apartment. He said I had refused to pay my final month's rent. He described me as difficult and threatening throughout our landlord-tenant relationship. None of it was true, but written on official letterhead with Rick's neat signature at the bottom, it looked serious enough to cause real problems. And called that same afternoon. He's stalling, she said, trying to muddy the record before the board reaches a decision. And it was working, at least temporarily. The case slowed down. Inspectors waited on further review. Rick began appearing at local council meetings, presenting himself as a longtime property owner being unfairly targeted by one disgruntled tenant. People who didn't know the full story started listening to him. I watched him do it from a distance. And for the first time since everything began, I felt the ground shift slightly beneath me. For a brief, unsettling moment, it looked like Rick might actually find a way to walk away from all of this. 3 weeks passed with nothing moving. I was staying in a short-term rental on the other side of town. A plain room with a window facing a parking lot. My belongings sat in a storage unit 2 miles away, still inside the same boxes Rick's men had stuffed them into. Every morning I checked my email. Every afternoon I went through paperwork with Anne. Every evening I checked the housing board's public page for updates. Nothing. Rick, meanwhile, walked around town without a care. Margaret told me he had already rented my former unit to a new tenant at a higher price. Exactly as planned from the beginning. Some nights I sat on the edge of the rental bed and wondered if fighting back had been a mistake. Maybe I should have found a new apartment quietly and moved on with my life. Legal paperwork piled up on both sides. His complaints against me. My complaints against him. Tom's statement still waiting for formal review. Then one Thursday morning my phone rang. Housing office. I picked up on the first ring. We've completed a full review of the new evidence in your case, the woman said. We need to meet with you in person. I sat up straight immediately. The meeting was held in a small conference room at the housing office. I sat across from 2 officials, and joined by phone through a speaker on the table between us. They began with Tom's materials. His photos and invoices were now part of the official record. Inspectors had cross-referenced every job Tom described against the building's actual wiring and structure. The work matched. Unlicensed. Unpermitted. A genuine fire hazard in every unit he had touched. Then one official said something that made me lean forward. They had reviewed Margaret's video again, more carefully this time. The 2 men Rick had hired to remove my belongings were not random strangers. One of them appeared in records connected to a separate Rick property, performing similar labor with no contractor registration on file whatsoever. Rick hadn't just ordered an illegal eviction. He had been using the same unlicensed workers across multiple properties as a standard part of how he ran his business. The pattern was now impossible to explain with any reasonable excuse. This case, one official said carefully, has grown significantly beyond the initial complaint. I looked at the speakerphone on the table and said nothing, but I could hear her breathing evenly, and I knew that steady silence meant we were on solid documented ground. After the housing office meeting, word spread through the building the way it always does. Tenants talk. News moves through hallways the way cold air moves under doors. By the end of that week, 4 other tenants from Rick's various properties had contacted the housing board on their own. A woman named Patrice who rented from Rick across town. She described months of ignored water damage followed by a flood of fake lease violations the moment she asked for a repair. A young couple, both school teachers, given 30 days to vacate after reporting a broken heating system in January. An older man named Walter who had lived in one of Rick's unregistered units for 2 full years, paying rent every month, with no legal tenant protections because his unit officially did not exist anywhere. Each story had the exact same shape. Move in. Notice a problem. Ask for help. Get pushed out. For years, every one of these people had felt alone in it. Embarrassed. Wondering if they had done something wrong. Margaret told me Patrice cried during her housing board interview when she finally understood what had actually happened to her. I sat with that for a long time. Every one of those people deserved better. And every one of their stories made our case impossible to ignore. The Town Housing Board scheduled a formal public hearing for the following month. The official notice listed Rick's full name and every property under investigation. When I read through the list, it was longer than I expected. 9 properties. Dozens of tenants across 4 years. I read it twice. And called that evening to prepare me for what was coming. Rick will have a lawyer, she said. He'll push hard to frame this as a personal dispute between the two of you. I told her I understood. Are you ready? She asked. I thought about the night I came home to my couch on the sidewalk. Rick's bored expression when he said, "Should have fixed your attitude." The way he turned and walked back inside like my entire life sitting in the street was a small task he had finished and forgotten. Yes, I told her. I was ready. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning at 9. I ironed my clothes the night before. I organized my folder one final time. Every email, every text, every dated receipt, every piece of paper I had saved since the very first night I called Rick about that sparking outlet. I had built this case one careful page at a time. And I was ready. The hearing room was larger than I had imagined. Long wooden tables in a wide U-shape. Council members seated along the far wall. A public gallery already half full when I arrived 20 minutes early. I sat beside and placed my folder on the table. Rick walked in at 8:55 with a lawyer in a dark blazer. He looked calm and relaxed, like a man who had faced complaints before and knew exactly how they ended. He didn't look at me once. The hearing opened formally. Rick's lawyer argued the investigation was an overreach driven by one disgruntled tenant with a personal agenda. He said the building violations were minor and already corrected. Then the board chair spoke. We'd like to review the video evidence submitted in this case. A screen was lowered at the far end of the room. Margaret's video began to play. Rick's voice filled the chamber. Clear. Calm. Completely recognizable. Take everything out. The council members watched without expression. The room was absolutely silent around that voice. Rick's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him. Rick stared at the screen. Then Tom was called forward to testify. And I watched the confidence drain slowly from Rick's face. Tom spoke for 12 minutes. He described every job Rick had asked him to do over 3 years. Electrical panels replaced without permits. Wiring rerouted in ways that broke fire code. Plumbing patched with materials not rated for the work. He spoke quietly and directly, like a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and was finally setting it down. Then the housing board's lead inspector stood up. He presented the full summary of what the investigation had uncovered across all 9 properties. 14 unregistered rental units across 3 buildings. Electrical violations in 7 properties. Safety inspections failed or deliberately avoided for 4 consecutive years. And a clear, repeated pattern. Tenant complaints followed immediately by evictions. Every single time just before expensive repairs became legally unavoidable. Rick's lawyer tried to interrupt twice. The board chair raised a hand both times and kept going. When the summary ended, the room settled into a particular kind of quiet. The kind that falls when everyone in the room has reached the same conclusion at once. Rick sat very still. The confidence he had walked in with was completely gone. His shoulders had dropped. His hands were flat on the table. He stared at a fixed point in front of him. He knew exactly where this was going now. The board deliberated for 2 hours. I sat in the hallway with Anne and a cup of coffee I barely touched. Tom sat nearby looking out the window. Margaret had come to watch and was beside me, hands folded neatly in her lap. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. At 11:43, the board chair returned and read the decision. Rental licenses suspended on 4 of Rick's buildings, effective immediately. Tenants in those buildings to be relocated at Rick's full expense. A mandatory safety audit required on all remaining properties before any new leases could be issued. And fines. Significant ones. The kind that don't quietly disappear. The board also referred the unregistered units and unpermitted electrical work to the county attorney's office for further criminal review. Rick's lawyer gave one final statement calling the decision excessive. The board chair did not respond to it. Rick stood up slowly. He looked older than when he had walked in that morning. He buttoned his jacket. He gathered his papers without looking at anyone. Then he walked out. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Tom. He didn't look at Margaret. For the first time since I moved into that apartment, Rick had no control left. 6 weeks after the hearing, I moved into a new apartment across town. 3rd floor. Bright kitchen. A landlord named Carl who handed me a proper lease and wrote his direct number at the top. "Call me first," he said simply. "That's what I'm here for." I signed the lease at his table and drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Normal. The housing board had compensated me for the damages. Storage fees, temporary housing costs, money for the disruption to my life. But money wasn't what stayed with me most. What stayed with me was a text from Patrice 3 days after the hearing. She had found a new apartment. Safe, affordable, properly inspected. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," she wrote. "Thank you." And a call from Walter, finally living in a registered unit with a real legal lease for the first time in years. Rick's buildings were under new oversight. New standards. Real accountability. The man who had thrown my belongings onto the sidewalk, like they meant nothing, had lost the thing he valued most. His power over other people. He had run that system for years because people were too afraid to push back. All it took was one person who refused to walk away. And one neighbor who thought to press record.